Do you think castles were warm? In fact, they were icy prisons? Now you will learn some shocking facts. Huge stone halls, drafty and with walls that froze through, turned the lives of even the most noble lords into a daily struggle for survival. Comfort, as we understand it today, was simply unknown. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how people managed not to freeze in these stone giants, using technologies that will seem both primitive and ingenious to you. What if I told you that absolutely everything you romantically believed about medieval castles and life in them is a beautiful lie and a delusion? Nowadays, we are used to seeing them as majestic fairy tale palaces from books and movies. But in harsh reality, a medieval castle was primarily a formidable military machine for war, not a comfortable home for a family to live in. From the moment of its design, its main primary function was reliable defense against enemies and survival during a siege, and not the creation of coziness, warmth, and comfort for its numerous inhabitants, which was a secondary task. Every element of the castle's design was subject to military logic rather than considerations of living comfort, which made it an extremely unpleasant place for everyday life in peacetime. The enormous thickness of the castle's massive stone walls, often reaching several meters, up to 5 meters at the base of the towers, served not at all to effectively preserve precious heat inside the rooms, as one might think, but exclusively for reliable protection against destructive siege weapons, catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams. Natural stone, due to its physical properties, is a terrible, extremely ineffective heat insulator. It very quickly accumulates the surrounding cold from the air and then slowly but steadily releases it into the rooms throughout the winter. As a result of this process, during harsh winters, the thick walls of a medieval castle effectively became huge ice panels, radiating cold, constantly cooling the air inside. The thicker the wall was for protection, the worse it worked as an insulator, creating a paradoxical situation where military necessity contradicted domestic comfort. The castle's few windows, which we now often romantically refer to as loopholes or embrasures, were deliberately narrow vertical slits, specifically designed for shooting arrows or crossbows at besiegers. They let in a minimum of daylight and a maximum of piercing drafts and cold air from outside, making the rooms dark and drafty. Expensive glass in the early Middle Ages, until the 13th and 14th centuries, was a rarity, available only to the very wealthy, and cost a fortune. So windows in most castles were often simply covered with oiled rags or parchment for translucency, or thick wooden shutters that completely blocked out the light. Glass was so expensive that it was sometimes removed and taken away when moving to another castle as valuable property. The internal layout of the castle also strictly followed the military logic of defense and war, rather than the domestic comfort of its inhabitants. The living quarters of the owner and his family were often deliberately located on the upper floors of the towers, away from the damp, cold ground, and for safety in case of a breach in the defenses. But this did not save them from the piercing wind that blew at height. The staircases inside the towers were spiral, narrow, and steep to make attacks from below more difficult, but they created constant, powerful drafts that swept through the entire building, from bottom to top like a chimney, sucking out the heat. These vertical air currents made it impossible to retain heat on any floor, as warm air immediately rose up the stairwells. The rooms of the castle themselves were deliberately huge in area and volume, especially the main hall for feasts and gatherings, where most of the social life of the inhabitants took place. It was practically impossible to effectively heat such a gigantic space with a very high vaulted ceiling of 10 to 15 meters, even with several fireplaces. The meager heat from the few fireplaces instantly escaped upward under the arches according to the laws of physics, leaving the people below, at floor level, in an icy, untouched atmosphere of cold. A paradoxical situation arose. It was hot under the ceiling due to the accumulation of warm air, but at human height, it was freezing cold, from which it was impossible to escape. Even the private quarters of the lord and his family, considered a privilege, were very far from the modern concept of coziness and comfort. Often, they were simply parts of a large common hall hastily partitioned off with heavy tapestries, without solid walls or small cramped rooms measuring a few square meters, directly adjacent to the cold outer wall of the fortress. Precious warmth in them was as scarce and luxurious as privacy or seclusion from prying eyes and ears. Even the nobility could not buy real warmth with money. The technology of the time simply did not allow for the effective heating of a stone building of such proportions. The very concept of a warm house in our modern understanding, with central heating, simply did not exist in the minds of medieval people as a possibility. The piercing cold was as integral and inevitable a part of everyday life as the natural change of day and night or the change of seasons. People of that time did not actively fight the cold in the hope of finally defeating it, but rather learned to humbly coexist with it as a given, gradually adapting and finding localized solutions for survival. They accepted the cold as an inevitable part of life that had to be endured rather than fought, as fighting seemed pointless and doomed to failure. The medieval engineers and architects of the time were true geniuses of fortification and defensive structures, creating impregnable fortresses, but complex issues of heating, insulation, and comfort were of little concern to them, if any. The main priority was to build the most impregnable fortress possible, capable of withstanding a long siege lasting many months by superior enemy forces and protecting the garrison. The physical survival of the garrison inside this besieged fortress depended primarily on food and drinking water supplies, and not at all on the temperature inside the rooms, which was considered a secondary factor. Hunger was worse than cold because you could protect yourself from the cold with clothing, but there was no protection from hunger. Thus, the architectural design of the castle itself, from the planning stage, assumed and took into account that it would be very cold inside during the winter months. This was an indisputable fact, an inevitable reality that was accepted without complaint by absolutely all the inhabitants, from the simple soldiers of the garrison to the powerful duke with his title. The whole complex system of survival in the castle in winter was based not on attempts to heat the entire huge building, which was unrealistic, but on the selective heating of the person themselves through clothing, furs, and proximity to local heat sources. The philosophy was simple. Don't heat the air, warm the body. This is the only realistic way to survive in a stone refrigerator. Do you think that such a harsh life in constant cold was a continuous suffering and torment for medieval people? Or were the people of that time so physically and psychologically hardened from childhood that they simply did not notice the cold as acutely as we do? Share your informed opinion in the comments below. I will reveal the best-kept secret of medieval decorators, which was actually a survival technique. When we look at images of medieval interiors, we see walls hung with huge, colorful tapestries. But their main function was not decoration, but insulation. A tapestry, or wall hanging, was a thick, lint-free carpet woven by hand from wool and silk threads. Wool is known to be an excellent heat insulator. These massive canvases were hung on special hooks along cold stone walls. The secret of their effectiveness lay in the creation of an air gap. A layer of still air remained between the cold stone wall and the tapestry. This air, heated by people's breath, the warmth of the hearth, served as a barrier that prevented the cold from the wall from penetrating into the room. It was the medieval equivalent of modern insulation. The effect was so significant that the temperature in a room with tapestries could be several degrees higher than in a room with bare walls. In conditions of constant cold, even such a small difference was noticeable. In addition, tapestries effectively combated drafts. They were hung not only on walls but also above doorways and windows, creating dense curtains. They prevented cold air from circulating freely through the rooms, making the space more enclosed and cozy. Of course, tapestries were a luxury item. The cost of one such canvas could be comparable to the cost of a small estate. Only the wealthiest feudal lords could afford them, which emphasized their status and wealth. The process of creating a tapestry was incredibly laborious. Several craftsmen could work on one large tapestry for several years. The subjects for tapestries were varied: biblical scenes, knightly exploits, hunting motifs. In addition to warmth, tapestries brought color and life to the gloomy stone halls. They also significantly improved the acoustics in huge echoing rooms by absorbing the echo. It was a multifunctional device that combined practicality, art, and a demonstration of power. For the less wealthy inhabitants of the castle, there were simpler alternatives. Walls could be hung with cheaper fabrics, skins, or even just thick straw mats. The principle remained the same, creating an insulating air gap. Fabric was the main weapon in the fight against the cold penetrating through the stone. But what if I told you that the main battle against the cold was not fought on the walls, but on the person themselves? And that clothing was a real multi-layered armor. What I am about to show you was the medieval equivalent of modern high-tech jackets, thought out down to the smallest detail. Forget the simple shirts and cloaks you see in movies. Medieval clothing was a complex, multi-layered system where each element had its own function. The basis of everything was the first layer, which was close to the body. It was made of linen, not wool. Linen absorbed sweat and moisture well, drawing it away from the body, which allowed the skin to remain dry and avoid hypothermia. Several layers of woolen clothing were worn over the linen shirt. Wool has a unique property. It continues to warm even when wet. It was the combination of moisture-wicking linen and warming wool that was the key to comfort. The number of layers depended on the weather and wealth. It could be 1 or 2 tunics of different lengths, and on top of them, another more spacious and longer garment. Each layer created an additional air gap that retained body heat. Outerwear, or surcoats, were often lined with fur. Fur was the most effective insulator of the time. Not only did it retain the heat well, but it also served as an indicator of the owner's high status. The legs were also well protected. Men wore narrow stockings called chausses, which were made of woolen fabric. Women wore long skirts, under which they also wore several layers of clothing and warm stockings. Particular attention was paid to protecting the head, neck, and hands. Hoods or hoods were an integral part of outerwear. They tightly covered the head and neck, and sometimes had a long tail that could be wrapped around the face in severe frost. Gloves and mittens were made of leather and lined with fur. They were necessary not only outdoors, but also indoors in cold rooms. Holding a metal cup or book in an unheated room was a real challenge. Shoes were made of thick leather, and felt or straw insoles were placed inside for extra warmth. In particularly cold weather, several pairs of woolen socks could be worn. Every detail of the wardrobe was designed with survival in mind. In this way, medieval people carried their own microclimate with them. This multi-layered system allowed them to respond flexibly to temperature changes by removing or adding layers. It was clothing, not the castle walls, that was their main refuge from the cold. Are you ready to learn in detail how the talented architects and builders of the past solved the complex problem of heating huge rooms without modern chimneys and central heating radiators? In the very center of the main hall, which was the true focal point of all social life in a medieval castle, a large open hearth was strategically located on the floor. This was not just a primitive place for building a fire in the open air, but a complex, well-thought-out engineering structure and an important social center of attraction for all the inhabitants of the castle, around which all life revolved. The hearth was a symbol of home, family, and the Lord's authority, a sacred place that could not be desecrated or extinguished without good reason. Imagine a large, carefully laid out, fireproof stone area several meters in diameter, right in the middle of a spacious hall at floor level. A huge roaring fire of thick logs was maintained there around the clock, day and night, and never went out completely. Good quality firewood for such a voracious hearth was required in truly colossal quantities, several cartloads a day, and its constant harvesting, cutting, and delivery was one of the most important and labor-intensive tasks for the numerous servants and inhabitants of the castle. Without a constant supply of dry firewood, life in the castle would come to a standstill, as the hearth was not only a source of heat, but also a means of cooking food for hundreds of people. The acrid smoke from the constantly burning fire naturally rose upwards, according to the laws of physics, to the high vaulted ceilings of the hall, creating a veil. A special wide opening, called a lucarne or smoke vent, was made in the roof directly above the hearth, sometimes with a wooden cover to protect it from the rain. Through it, a large but not all of the smoke slowly escaped to the fresh air, although, of course, not all of it, and not always effectively, especially when the wind was unfavorable. The effectiveness of such ventilation depended heavily on the direction of the wind outside. When the wind was blowing in the opposite direction, the smoke could not escape at all and remain in the room, making the air unbreathable. This is why the high ceilings and upper parts of stone walls in medieval halls were always covered with a thick, greasy layer of black soot that had eaten into the stone. The air in the room was constantly filled with smoke of varying concentrations around the clock, which was one of the main causes of frequent chronic respiratory diseases, coughs, and lung problems among the inhabitants. But the harsh choice was extremely simple and without alternative. Between acrid smoke that stung the eyes and the icy, deadly cold of winter that could kill. People chose smoke as the lesser evil, as the cold killed faster than the smoke, although both options were harmful to health and shortened life expectancy. Absolutely all of the active social life of the castle and its inhabitants was concentrated around this central hearth with its dancing flames. Here, professional cooks prepared food in huge smoky cauldrons suspended on chains above the fire. And here all the inhabitants of the castle, from the lord to the servants, gathered to warm themselves by the fire, socialize, and discuss the news. The closer a person sat or stood to the hot fire, the higher their social status and position in the feudal hierarchy of the castle. The lord and his family occupied places directly by the fire, in places of honor, while the commoners huddled on the periphery in the cold, content with the remnants of heat. The blazing hearth itself was an important source not only of vital heat for warmth, but also of bright light for illumination in the darkness. In the huge, gloomy hall, lit only by a few smoky torches on the walls and expensive wax candles on the tables, the large roaring fire created a relatively cozy, bright, and warm space around itself, with a radius of several meters. It was the true beating heart of the entire castle, pulsing day and night, never stopping. An extinguished hearth was seen as a bad omen and a symbol of death in the house, so they tried to keep it burning constantly, even in the absence of the owners. The precious heat from the hot hearth was mainly spread by radiant infrared energy, like a modern heater. It directly heated solid furniture and the bodies of people nearby within the flame's range, but it did almost nothing to warm the cold air in the huge room, which was thousands of cubic meters in size. Therefore, moving just a few steps away from the hot fire, a frozen person would immediately be plunged back into the piercing cold, as if the fire did not exist. The temperature contrast was enormous and created discomfort. One side of the body was roasted by the fire, while the other froze from the cold, forcing people to constantly turn around. This primitive heating system with a central hearth was extremely inefficient from the modern point of view of heating technology and energy conservation. A huge amount of valuable heat simply escaped uselessly through a wide opening in the roof along with hot smoke and red-hot sparks, without bringing any benefit. But for many centuries, from the early to the late Middle Ages, this was the only known and affordable way to heat a large public space with high ceilings and bring people together. There was simply no alternative, and people put up with this wasteful system for lack of a better one. It was only in the late Middle Ages, around the 13th, 14th centuries, that the first wall-mounted fireplaces with vertical chimneys built into the thickness of the wall gradually appeared, revolutionizing living conditions and comfort. They made it possible to heat individual small rooms much more efficiently and completely get rid of acrid smoke in the room by venting it outside through a pipe. But before this technological breakthrough, the central open hearth remained for centuries the only source of heat, light, and social life in the castle, around which everything revolved. The transition to fireplaces took decades, as the construction of chimneys required considerable engineering knowledge and expense. But even the thickest, most massive castle walls, several meters thick, and a large blazing fire in the center of the hall, could not completely protect the inhabitants from the pervasive cold in winter. In the next chapter, we will talk in detail about how inventive people created localized areas of warmth and comfort in their private quarters and bedrooms using various tricks. If the main hall was heated by a large stationary hearth, how was the heat maintained in the Lord's private chambers, where it was impossible to build a fire on the floor? For this purpose, there were special portable devices, braziers. They were medieval analogs of modern portable heaters. A brazier was a metal or ceramic bowl on legs. Hot coals from the main hearth were placed inside this bowl. The brazier radiated gentle heat, capable of warming a small enclosed space, such as a bedroom or study. The use of braziers required great care. Open coals posed a serious fire hazard. Therefore, braziers were usually placed in the center of the room, away from wooden furniture, beds, and tapestries. The main fuel for braziers was charcoal, not ordinary firewood. Charcoal burned with virtually no smoke or flame, while giving off a lot of heat. This was critically important for use in enclosed spaces without special ventilation. However, the smokeless combustion of coal posed another invisible danger: carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide poisoning was not uncommon in medieval castles. Therefore, rooms where braziers were used had to be ventilated periodically, despite the cold. Braziers were not only functional objects, but also works of art. They were made of bronze or iron and decorated with embossing and intricate ornaments. A rich brazier, like a tapestry, was an indicator of its owner's status. They were used not only to heat rooms. Small braziers were placed under the table during meals to warm the feet. There were even special small braziers for warming the hands, which noble ladies carried with them. The process of maintaining braziers was continuous. Servants had to constantly bring new portions of hot coals from the main hearth and remove the cooled ashes. Keeping the master's chambers warm was one of their many duties. Braziers were a compromise solution that allowed for the creation of an island of warmth in the icy ocean of the castle. They were inefficient and dangerous, but in the absence of other technologies, they at least provided the illusion of comfort. It was a local rather than a global heating system. Thus, the castle's heating was multi-level. The huge hearth in the main hall served as the main source of heat, and braziers carried this heat to individual rooms. But even this was not enough to fully protect against the cold. What if I showed you a medieval technology that allowed you to create a personal oasis of warmth in the middle of an icy room? It's not a heater or clothing, it's a bed, which in the Middle Ages was not just a piece of furniture, but a complex architectural structure. The bed of a noble feudal lord was a massive wooden structure with 4 posts at the corners. A wooden frame, or canopy, was attached to these posts. The bed was draped on all sides with thick, heavy curtains, often made of velvet or wool and lined with fur. When the curtains were drawn, the bed turned into a small room inside a large room. The enclosed space under the canopy quickly heated up from the warmth of the human body. This heat trap allowed one to sleep in comfort, even if the temperature in the bedroom itself was below freezing. Mattresses or feather beds were stuffed with down and feathers, which retained heat very well. A thick layer of straw was laid on the wooden base of the bed for additional insulation from the cold air. Sleep was multi-layered and warm. The bedding also consisted of several layers. First came a linen sheet, and on top of it, several woolen blankets and fur covers. People slept wrapped in a whole mountain of warm fabrics. Before going to bed, a special hot water bottle was placed in the bed. It was a metal or ceramic vessel with a tight-fitting lid. Hot coals from the brazier were placed inside it, and the hot water bottle slowly gave off heat to the bed for several hours. Often, several people slept in one bed. This was done not only because of lack of space, but also for warmth. Children slept with their parents or nannies, and guests could sleep in the same bed with their hosts, which was considered a sign of special favor. The bed itself was one of the most expensive items in the castle. It was a symbol of status and was often passed down from generation to generation. It was richly decorated with carvings and inlays. Thus, the bed was the last line of defense against the cold. If the castle was a fortress protecting against enemies, then the bed with a canopy was a fortress within a fortress protecting against the cold. It was here in this small, warm world that medieval man could finally rest from the eternal struggle for survival. Heating the room and warming up in bed was only half the battle. In the next chapter, you will learn how medieval inhabitants warmed themselves from the inside, using food and drink as fuel. In the Middle Ages, heat was obtained not only from outside but also from within. The diet of castle dwellers was directly linked to the need to survive in the cold. High-calorie, fatty, and hot food was not a whim, but a necessity, fuel for the inner fire. The diet consisted mainly of thick soups and stews, which were cooked in huge cauldrons over an open fire. They were made from meat, beans, root vegetables, and grains. Such food retained heat for a long time and provided the body with a lot of energy for self-heating. Meat was an important part of the diet, especially in winter. Fatty meats such as pork and lamb were particularly highly valued. Fat is a concentrated source of energy that was necessary to maintain body temperature. Bread was also an integral part of the meal. It was dense and filling, eaten with butter, lard, or simply dipped in hot soup. It was a simple and affordable source of carbohydrates that provided quick energy. Spices played an important role. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper were all considered hot and warming. They were generously added not only to food but also to drinks. The most popular warming drink was heated ale or wine. Honey and spices were added to them, creating a kind of medieval mulled wine. Hot alcoholic beverages created a quick, albeit short-lived, feeling of warmth and lifted the spirits. Breakfast was usually hearty and hot. It could be porridge with milk or ale, leftovers from yesterday's stew, or just bread with lard. Getting a hot meal in the morning was important to get the internal stove going for the whole day. The process of eating itself was a warming ritual. All the inhabitants of the castle gathered in the main hall by the hearth. Hot food, warmth from the fire, and the closeness of other people all helped to combat the cold. Even the water they drank was often warm. It was taken from cauldrons hanging above the hearth. Drinking ice-cold water in a cold room was not only unpleasant, but also dangerous to health. Thus, the medieval diet was ideally suited to the harsh conditions. It was aimed at maximizing energy intake, which was spent not on physical work, but on simply sustaining life in an icy stone world. Food was as much a part of the heating system as firewood or coal. In addition to all the technical tricks, there was another most important factor for survival: the human factor. The consciousness and habits of medieval people were completely different. What seems unbearably cold to us was normal for them. People were hardened and adapted to low temperatures from childhood. Their bodies were trained to constantly fight to stay warm. Modern people, who have grown up in the comfort of central heating, simply do not have the same level of physiological resilience. Community life played a crucial role. The concept of personal space was virtually unknown. People spent most of their time together in the main hall, and this had direct practical significance. A large gathering of people is itself a source of heat. Every human body radiates energy, and in a confined space, this leads to a noticeable increase in temperature. The more people in the hall, the warmer it is. Working together also helped to keep warm. Work, dancing, games, any physical activity got the blood flowing and prevented people from freezing. An idle and sedentary lifestyle in a cold castle was simply impossible. During the winter months, life in the castle came to a standstill. People tried to use only the smallest and most easily heated rooms. Often, the lord's entire family would move into 1 or 2 rooms that could be heated with braziers, while the rest of the rooms remained empty until spring. Psychological attitude also played a role. People did not perceive the cold as a disaster. It was a seasonal hardship that had to be endured, just as one endured a storm or a drought. There was a clear daily routine tied to daylight hours. When darkness fell, life moved closer to sources of fire. Long winter evenings were spent chatting, doing needlework, or listening to stories by the hearth. The awareness that everyone around them was in the same situation created a sense of unity. Fighting the cold was a common task that united the inhabitants of the castle. It was a collective, not an individual, survival strategy. Thus, the human factor was no less important than tapestries or braziers. Adaptation, collectivism, and the right psychological attitude allowed people to survive in conditions that seem incompatible with life today. They did not so much defeat the cold as learn to live in harmony with it. Medieval builders and architects may not have had a deep understanding of scientific heating engineering as a discipline, which did not exist at the time, but they had a perfect, intuitive understanding of nature and its laws from experience. The correct location of the castle on the terrain and its competent orientation to the cardinal points played an extremely important, often underestimated role in the passive solar heating of the building without fuel costs. This was ancient folk wisdom, accumulated over many centuries of careful observation of natural cycles and passed down orally from master to apprentice. Builders did not know the physical formulas of heat transfer, but they understood in practice how the sun and wind work and used this knowledge to create more comfortable living conditions in harsh climates. Castles were strategically built on natural elevations and hills, as open as possible to direct sunlight for most of the day. The southern slope of a hill, protected from the north, was an ideal location for construction in terms of both defense and climate. This location allowed for the most efficient use of the scarce solar heat during the short winter days, when every ray counted. A castle on the southern slope received sunlight from dawn to dusk, while a castle in a low-lying area or on the northern slope could remain in the shade for most of the day, making it significantly colder and wetter. The most important and prestigious living quarters of the castle, such as the private chambers of the lord and his family and the staterooms, were deliberately placed on the south, sunny side of the castle for maximum comfort. The few windows in these privileged rooms necessarily faced south to catch and let in every precious ray of the weak winter sun throughout the day. Sunlight penetrating through the narrow windows into the room, even for a few hours, noticeably heated the cold stone floor and massive walls, which then slowly, throughout the night, released the accumulated heat back into the room, acting as natural heat accumulators. This effect of thermal inertia of stone was used intuitively, although the builders did not know the scientific explanation for the process. The north side of the castle, on the other hand, was the coldest, most drafty, and most vulnerable to the piercing icy winds blowing from the north. Therefore, it was on this unfavorable side that secondary utility buildings, dark storage rooms for supplies, granaries, and narrow stair towers without windows were usually deliberately located. They served as an additional architectural buffer and barrier, effectively protecting the valuable living quarters from the icy north wind by taking the brunt of it. These auxiliary rooms created a zone that partially isolated the living quarters from the harshest weather conditions from the north. The castle's inner courtyard, surrounded by walls on all sides, also played an important climatic role in creating a microclimate. On rare, clear winter days, it effectively turned into a real trap for solar heat and light, accumulating energy. The high stone walls surrounding the courtyard on four sides heated up intensely under the direct rays of the sun, and then created a noticeably warmer, wind-protected microclimate inside the courtyard than outside the castle in the open air. The temperature in the courtyard could be several degrees higher than outside the walls, making it a natural refuge from the cold and a place to bask in the sun even in winter. In addition to using the sun and proper orientation, people actively and ingeniously used the natural resources and materials that the surrounding land generously provided them with for free. The floors in castles were cold stone slabs or simply compacted earth. They were always covered with a thick, dense layer of dry rye or wheat straw, or dry grass and reeds from the marshes, which were changed regularly. This simple layer of vegetation served several important functions in everyday life. This thick layer of straw not only made the hard floor much softer and more pleasant to walk on barefoot, but also served as an excellent, effective insulator against the cold from below. Straw, with its hollow structure, retained air and heat inside and prevented the cold from rising from the icy ground or stone to people's feet. This protective layer was regularly replaced with fresh straw every few weeks or months, as it quickly became contaminated with food residues, became damp, and began to smell bad, attracting parasites. The old straw was burned or used as fertilizer in the fields, completing the cycle of use. In winter, during the coldest months, this insulating layer of straw was made especially thick for maximum protection from the cold. Some historical sources and chronicles mention that it could reach an impressive thickness of several tens of centimeters, creating a real carpet. You could literally sink ankle deep into this soft straw bedding when walking, but it effectively protected your feet from contact with the icy stone floor, which was as cold as ice. Walking on such a floor was much more comfortable than on bare stone, although it did create problems with cleanliness. Sometimes aromatic herbs with a strong scent, lavender, mint, wormwood, or rosemary, were deliberately added to the top layer of fresh straw to mask the unpleasant smells of decay and dampness in the room. It was a simple, accessible, yet surprisingly effective system that elegantly solved two problems at once: floor insulation and basic indoor air hygiene. Life in the castle was closely linked to natural seasonal cycles and available local materials, which was natural for an agrarian society. People depended on the harvest not only for food, but also for their daily needs. Thus, resourceful medieval people skillfully used both the sun's resources through architecture and natural materials from the earth to constantly combat the pervasive cold and discomfort. The correct strategic location of the building in relation to the cardinal points and the active use of available natural insulating materials such as straw were an essential part of the overall comprehensive strategy for survival in a cold climate. This was a deep intuitive understanding of the fundamental laws of heat transfer physics, based on centuries of practical experience passed down orally from fathers to sons as invaluable knowledge. All the methods we have discussed were merely ways of adapting to the cold, not defeating it. They allowed local areas of warmth to be created, but could not heat the entire castle. The real revolution in everyday life came with the invention and spread of the wall-mounted fireplace with a chimney. This technology, which appeared in the high and late Middle Ages, changed everything. The idea was simple: move the hearth from the center of the hall to the wall and enclose it in a stone firebox. And instead of venting the smoke through a hole in the roof, it was vented through a special vertical channel inside the wall: a chimney. The advantages were enormous. First, it completely solved the problem of smoke in the rooms. The air in the halls became clean and breathable, and the walls and ceilings were no longer covered with soot. Secondly, the fireplace was much more efficient than an open hearth. It radiated heat in a targeted manner, deep into the room rather than in all directions. This allowed the room to be heated more efficiently while using less wood. The advent of fireplaces changed the very architecture and social structure of the castle. Now it was possible to effectively heat not only one huge hall, but many small rooms. This gave impetus to the development of the concept of privacy. The lord and his family were able to move from the common hall to their own warm and cozy quarters. The castle ceased to be just a collective refuge and began to turn into a home with private spaces. This was the beginning of the end of classical medieval life. Fireplaces began to be installed not only in the lord's chambers, but also in guest rooms, libraries, and studies. The opportunity to be warm and secluded contributed to the development of culture, reading, and science. Comfort ceased to be an unattainable luxury. The construction of fireplaces and chimneys was a complex and expensive undertaking, requiring highly skilled masons. Having several fireplaces in a castle became a new symbol of status and wealth. They were decorated with carvings, coats of arms, and sculptures. With the spread of fireplaces, many old methods gradually became a thing of the past. Braziers became less necessary, and tapestries began to serve mainly a decorative function. The canopy bed, however, remained popular for a long time, as it provided an unmatched level of comfort. It was the chimney that drew the line between medieval survival and the comforts of the new era. This simple but ingenious invention finally allowed people to tame the cold inside their homes. The icy stone prison gradually began to transform into a warm and cozy home. We can see that life in a medieval castle was far from the fairy tale images we have. It was a constant, inventive struggle against the cold, using all available means, from layers of clothing and tapestries to braziers and fortress beds. Every element of daily life was subordinated to one main goal: survival. These methods show us how resourceful and adaptable humans can be. In the absence of the technologies we are accustomed to, people created their own, based on a deep understanding of materials and the laws of nature. It was a whole science of survival, honed over centuries. The history of heating castles is a story of a gradual shift from collective survival around a common hearth to individual comfort in private quarters, made possible by the chimney revolution. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new explorations of the mysteries of the past.